What's going on, y'all? Shout out to the LDBC. It's your boy Fight Critic, and here to give you guys another video. And I didn't choose to make this video. I am simply using the insight, intelligence of Eddie Hearn. So, as you know, uh, Eddie Hearn is definitely excited about Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury, and with that excitement comes a large amount of delusion that Hearn tends to speak to the media. And recently, in an interview that he did that is on Boxing Scene, I am not making any of these statements up. This is actually something that he said. He says that he believes that Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury can make Mayweather money. And he clarified those statements, stating that Hearn mentioned Mayweather in response to a question from co-host Akin Reyes regarding whether Fury and Joshua would make $100 million apiece for their fight. Not total, but apiece. And he was quoted saying, I think, a lot depends on the numbers around the fight. In terms of revenue, the site fees, the pay-per-view numbers, the international TV. Hearn said during a show that streams Monday through Friday on DAZN and Sirius XM. But I certainly think, the biggest fight, the most lucrative fight in boxing right now, unquestionably. Now, in terms of the magnitude of Joshua versus Fury and what it means to the heavyweight division in boxing in general, I agree. It's a big fight. It's a fight that will make a good amount of money sense. It'll make a lot of sense for the heavyweight division. It is the undisputed heavyweight championship, and albeit it's between two British fighters, it's a big fight. But when you put this fight in the realm of a Floyd Mayweather fight, there are a lot of questions that you have to start asking yourselves. And for me, being that not only do I have a background in just economics and business, but I love numbers. And I love numbers when it comes to boxing because it gives me at least a thought process around what would a Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury fight look like if it were to want to make Mayweather money, meaning that each guy would make $100 million a piece. Not together, but $100 million a piece. Now, if Eddie Hearn says that this fight could generate Mayweather kind of money and keep out the $100 million, I would definitely agree when I look at everything on the surface. But I am solely targeting what this fight would look like if this fight essentially was in a way that allowed both guys to make $100 million apiece. But before we could even do all of that, we have to look into the numbers. So, using the internet, of course, and using some brash thinking on my part, I pulled every single 1 million pay-per-view by plus fight that Floyd Mayweather did. And I also pulled the ones that Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury did, just as to kind of put things into perspective. Now, of course, a lot of these numbers you're seeing, and you're not seeing much of any chart, identification. So let's just basically just go through this so that this way you guys don't lose your footing. On the first column, we have, the fight that is being, presented. And of course, the second column is the pay-per-view buys that were reported. The third column is the amount of revenue generated from the fight. And the fourth column is the fight revenue generated adjusted for inflation, being that some of these fights date back to when pay-per-view was considered at a lower price rather than what the current market price is. Now, in this fifth column, I have also included the reported plus the projected fight purse after pay-per-view buy ticket sales. So that's combined into one, and I did not notate who made what, simply because we know what these guys are looking towards making, so it doesn't really matter what each guy made in this fight. And then the final column is what the fight purse would have been adjusted for inflation should the pay-per-view price that we see today was where it was back then. Now, when you look at this just on the surface of it, there is quite a bit of an anomaly here. Now, of course, Floyd Mayweather has fought 9 pay-per-views over the 1 million buy rate, and his most expensive fight being the Manny Pacquiao and the Conor McGregor fight, in which those fights generated north of 5 million pay-per-view buys. And at the same time, these are total pay-per-view buys, I should say, around the world, not just the US, but around the world, generating $500 million in revenue. And of course, the fighter purses being somewhere around 410 to 420 million. Now, the reason there's no inflation next to these is because these fights were booked and priced at a premium. So we have to now ask ourselves, well, how does Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury's numbers kind of stack up? And of course, you have those numbers towards the bottom. Anthony Joshua has had 4 pay-per-view fights so far that have generated over 1 million buys globally. And in that time span, the most expensive generating fight that he has known registered is the Klitschko fight. Now, the Ruiz 2 fight is a fight that I had to actually pull projections out of, because when you looked at the buy rate, you also had to look at the fact that this fight was purchased at a premium in Saudi Arabia, which means that if the total projected fight person, which both guys were reported, and then the upside to it would be totaling $71.25 million, when you adjust based off of the reflection rate of what Joshua has been able to do in terms of the size of the total purse fight in comparison to what it's generated, I took those percentages and I used those percentages to generate what the total record revenue would be, which would be $95 million in generated revenue. And I did the same thing for Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury. We know the pay-per-view buy rate was 1.2 million, but we don't really know what the record generated revenue was, as well as the fighter purse. Well, even though both guys stood to make a nightly purse of what considered somewhere between $5 to $10 million a piece, ESPN's Dan Rafael interviewed both fighters, and both fighters gave Dan Rafael context in terms of what they were making, and essentially both fighters had already been promised to be guaranteed on the back end $25 million a piece. So, and that's a number that is excluding upside. So with everything that's being reported, Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury made combined $50 million in terms of revenue. And then you have to think about, well, what's the upside? And if the upside sees them make anywhere from 25 to 30% on top of it, then it feels rather safe to say that both guys ended up taking home total of $75 million collectively. And then you kind of take those percentages and you do the same math for what I got for the Ruiz versus Joshua 2 fight, which brings you back essentially to just about $99 million of generated revenue. Now, for Wilder versus Fury 2, it makes sense for, it makes sense for this fight to be in that neighborhood realm, only because the fight took place in Vegas. It was a big fight. It sold a lot of tickets. The gate was very, very good. And I feel comfortable saying that this fight generated $99 million, just as comfortable as I feel that Ruiz versus Joshua generated $95 million. So now we have a little bit of what needs to be accomplished in order to do so. So the next thing we have to look at is, well, what will it take for Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury to make $100 million each, or basically twice the fight Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury 2 made? And then we have to kind of zone in on that scope. So we look at the Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury 2 fight that generated the 1.2 million buys, the projected revenue of 99 million, and then the projected purse of 75 million. And of course, there are no inflation numbers here, considering that that fight takes place at the current market value for pay-per-view. So now you have to look at, well, what would it take for these guys to make just their guarantees, which is essentially $200 million collectively. Now, if you do the math and you do the backwards math for it, you would notice that this fight would need to generate 3 million pay-per-view buys at minimum, and the revenue would need to be at least $250 million. Then you would have to look at, well, what if these guys are set to make upside? What would that need to generate? Because remember, my projected numbers previously were set on what these guys made with their upside. Now, $200 million here would be that full projection. But I decided just to make a guarantee to let you know, well, what's the floor? for it. Now let's look at the ceiling in terms of what it would need to do. Well, these guys would eventually end up splitting $332 million apiece, and they would need to generate $415 million at 5 million plus pay-per-view buys. That is what the projection would be for this fight in order for it to happen. So we then have to look at, well, we have to ask ourselves a very fundamental question. To make these projections to ensure both Joshua and Tyson Fury see $100 million apiece, they would need to generate the third richest boxing fight of all time. Now you ask yourself, is Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury, in quotations, during COVID, a bigger boxing fight than Mayweather Jr. versus De La Hoya, or even Mayweather Jr. versus Ricky Hatton? And Mayweather versus De La Hoya generated, per inflation, $200 million in revenue, and the Ricky Hatton fight, per inflation, generated 170 million pay-per-view buys. And I hate that this has a typo. There we go. So now that we have made this small bit of adjustment and we know what we're looking at, we also have to take a look at a couple things. Well, number one that we have to take a look at is the fact that this fight took place in Las Vegas, which has one of the biggest economies in the world, in order to generate this type of revenue. Vegas generates more revenue than the entire country of London at times. And at the same time, Vegas is just a city that's part of Nevada. So a city is generating more than not only London, but also England entirely. And Vegas isn't that big of a city as well. And you also look at the fact that this was on a US pay-per-view during prime pay-per-view time, and which means that you ordered the fight roughly around 8 o'clock. You know that you're not going to get serious for the fight until anywhere between 10 and 12, which kind of corresponds to the UK walk-up time of about 5 a.m. And for many UK fans, they would normally tend to sleep during the evenings, early evenings, in order to make their way through the middle of the night in order to watch a US pay-per-view. If you were to adjust this to meet the needs of the UK market's pay-per-view, this fight would be on a US pay-per-view at roughly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in which these guys would be starting. And if you wanted these guys to walk out to the ring, which would be somewhere close to 10, 11 o'clock UK time, you're looking at 5 to 6 o'clock in US time, which on a weekend afternoon does really, really bad when you look at the fact that a lot of sports are roughly on during those times, and boxing tends to do really well because the very, very late sports are just boxing and mixed martial arts. You know, basketball games are on that time, but they don't really do well when you match them up versus a high-level boxing fight like this on pay-per-view. So now you have to ask yourself, can an international market target $250 million in generated revenue to $450 million in generated revenue without much of the U.S. backing? We know that the largest known right now is Joshua versus Vlad, which was $64 million in terms of the total revenue, while the projection for Joshua Ruiz is $95 million. So let's also look at cost. Because of COVID, we do not know if there will be fans, but let's say there were fans. The gate would need to be on par with Mayweather Pacquiao, and that's a record of $72 million at the gate. But we could also use the Mayweather-McGregor gate, which is roughly $56 million. It's about 55.5, so I'm actually giving it a little bit more of a generous push. But in these respective revenues, Mayweather versus Pacquiao sold 16,219 tickets, which gives you an average ticket price of $4,439.23. And I did not give the pound conversion to this only because I do it later. Mayweather-McGregor's ticket sales were 13,094 at roughly a average price of $4,276. So, as you can see, the more tickets were sold for Mayweather-Pacquiao, the larger revenue, and then for Mayweather-McGregor, less tickets, but roughly still in the same neighborhood of average ticket price, which gives you the sense that a lot of the premium tickets for Mayweather-McGregor probably sold a little bit higher, which is probably why they weren't able to meet the full stadium requirement. But let's just say that, you know, we managed to get, and I'll just do some math on the fly if it allows me to. So where is my calculator? There we go. So let's say you have the 16,219 tickets minus the 13,094. So 3,125 tickets needed to be sold. So if you did that times the 4,276 ticket price, an extra $13 million was missing. So you add that to the $56 million, and that gives you $69 million, which means that if they filled in the right amount of revenue, it still falls short. So the average ticket price, in fact, actually for Mayweather Pacquiao is slightly higher priced. But if you did do, this number and you divided it by the 16,219 tickets, that means the average ticket price would stay roughly the same. So next we move on to, well, we know about Wembley and 100,000 Brits going crazy, screaming, being hooligans, being passionate. We have to factor that in. 100,000 people. So let's talk about Wembley. And let's say COVID was not a variable for Wembley. Well, the max capacity for Wembley is 90,000. Don't know where that one came from. Cool. So max capacity is 90,000. 90,000 people for Wembley. And let's say we did the math for what's the average ticket price. So Joshua versus Vlad's essentially its reported gate is $11 million. I didn't make up that number. That's what was out there. So 90,000 people at 11 million gate gives you about $122 per ticket, and that's roughly 90 pounds. And honestly, that makes a ton of sense considering how massive Wembley is. And I've said this from the jump, and I've said this a lot of times. I don't know what's the thing about people being excited about attending a boxing fight in a massive arena that has more than 20,000 people. I hate the idea of being in a venue that large and having to rely on watching a jumbotron for the fight. I don't care about the environment. I came here so I can be close to the ring. And a 20,000 seat venue is a lot easier to navigate instead of 100,000 people 5 times the size. And when you look at 100,000 people for a pitch, that's more doable considering that the ring is probably going to take up maybe a tenth of the pitch, and then you've got to put the extra seating in. So it made a ton of sense for them to put this fight here and to charge such a cheap amount for tickets. $122 is cheaper than what most standard level fights here in America are. I think I paid more to just attend Wilder versus Ortiz. But to make close to the gate for Mayweather versus McGregor, meaning that if you wanted the 90,000 people to hit a $56 million gate, you would be looking at 454 pounds. That means if you are sitting way at the top, the price of it is going to be less than 454 pounds, but if you get closer, it's going to be much, much higher. So the average price is going to leave you at roughly 454 pounds. So if you're somebody who's more than likely going to be sitting in the median section, do you want to pay 454 pounds? And if they were targeting the Mayweather Pacquiao gate, which is 72 million, you're looking at 585 pounds. So that is roughly an 80 to 85% increase of what the original ticket for Joshua versus Vlad is. So that's if Wembley didn't have any COVID restrictions. But let's say you were working at a COVID restriction, meaning that you could put max 20% capacity in there. Now, while max 20% capacity of 90,000 people is roughly 18,000, I bumped it up to 20,000 just to give you guys a little bit of room to make a little bit more. So those projections, $56 million gate at 20,000 people is $2,800 a ticket, and that's 2,050 pounds. $72 million at 20,000 is roughly a $3,600 price tag average, and that's 2,632 pounds. That means that your entry-level ticket might be the entry-level ticket for this chart. And if you are somebody who plans on sitting closer to the ring, you're probably going to be paying a shit ton of money in order to attend a limited capacity fight that is looking to target these projections. And the reason why I'm saying all this is because these are what Mayweather money look like. Well, it's not real sentence, but this is what Mayweather money looks like in terms of the gate. You would need to do these numbers in order to generate that type of purse. So while I say that there's not to mention one huge variable that we haven't spoken about, there's technically a couple of variables. Mayweather's control on all his boxing fights. And you have to look at the fact that Mayweather had contracts with venues directly. The MGM was paying Floyd Mayweather a separate fee that it was not part of the site fee for him to fight fights, in their arena. And the MGM owns the T-Mobile arena as well. So I would assume that a similar deal was made for Floyd in that regard. Well, Floyd also did it with limited to no sponsors, which is quite impressive. I think the only sponsors that he ended up, getting towards the end of his career was DraftKings and Hublot. But other than that, Floyd made much of his money without sponsors. And Floyd had contracts with broadcasters directly. So guys like Showtime were paying Floyd Mayweather a specific amount of money that was factored into his actual purse. And last but not least, Mayweather Promotions. Floyd Mayweather operated as an entity of a promoter. Joshua and Fury have promoters, while Floyd, in his two richest fights of all time, the fights that they would need to be projected, he was his own promoter. So there was no him having to shave off 33% to give to anybody else. But Joshua and Fury, they will have to take partial of their purses and hand those over to Arum and Hearn respectively. So ultimately, in the end, no, Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury cannot net them $100 million apiece due to, well, of course, COVID, but also they wouldn't be maximizing the US pay-per-view revenue if they put this fight in the UK. There is no US live gate revenue, which would give them 5 times the amount of gate revenue that they would generate in the UK with or without COVID. And 80 to 85% of ticket sales increase for Wembley would need to be projected to hit that target in order for them to have a shot, something that I don't foresee the UK market paying for. But it's still a big fight nonetheless. And the moral of this breakdown is Eddie Hearn is once again an idiot. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. I know it's rather long, but I think at the end of the day, it's up to us to be honest with ourselves and hold promoters accountable for some of the dumb shit that they say.